Well, you've seen football games in the past, and one of the ones that makes for such a dramatic scene is when you see all these great big huge guys all piled up together in the middle of the field, and they're all running into each other. And then all of a sudden a runner emerges and is going off down the side, and he's going down the field just as fast and as hard as he can. And we all know that if he dares to even turn his head slightly to glance over his shoulder, he's toast, right? And he's just running like the world is on fire. And I have seen those games where he just glances back and that's the end of him. And we've seen the ones where he drives on, and can you imagine the fear of knowing running, and you can't look back to see how close somebody is on you, and you could go face down any second. Are you ready to run into life with that energy and enthusiasm and determination? Maybe even get it up to a quick walk? A brisk pace? This is what God is calling us to do, not just individually, but corporately as a church. And we're going to take a look this morning at what a particular passage means for us as a group, as well as the way it was interpreted for people who are called for those occasional opportunities to really strike out ahead and run for the goal. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4 says, "The righteous shall live by faith." The righteous shall live by faith. In the original Hebrew version, that word is the faithful people, meaning the whole group, everybody, all together. The whole nation, the whole team, the whole church. It's not just one, it's plural. Everybody together is to live by faith. So back to my football analogy, which I'm not an expert on, but all those great big guys that are all there running into each other, they have what seems like a pointless enterprise. But for their purposes, they've got to keep doing it by faith that the guy that they know is supposed to take off running is going to actually get the ball and really do it. They have to keep at what they're doing, even though they're not going to get all the glory. Nobody will pay attention to them. They're just going to focus on the one that's running. By faith, they have to stick together and keep doing what they're doing, otherwise the whole thing is shot. So when Habakkuk says, "The righteous shall live by faith," it means all of us and all together. The faithful people are preserved by trust in God. The whole nation, the whole team, and in the time that Habakkuk lived, the enemies were trying to destroy them. Everything was horrible. Nothing was good. It was just terrible. And it was really hard to hold the line. And it was really hard to stick together and not get into a bunch of cat fighting and turning on each other and criticizing each other and putting each other down. Because when times get hard, people either pull together and set aside their own egos, or else they turn on each other and it's a cat fight. So when it says the righteous, plural, together will live by faith, it's an opportunity, it's a calling, it's a command to set aside our egos, turn towards each other, support each other, encourage each other, and keep working on the same purpose, whether it's our job to hold the line or we're one of those that has that glory opportunity, really scary chance to run down the sideline and go for the goal. While the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, Pharaoh ordered that the baby boys would all be killed. Times were hard. It was really scary. It's bad enough to be a slave. It's really bad when the slave owners really seriously turn on you. And the Hebrew midwives were the ones that held the line. Nobody knew their names. They just blended into the background. If they didn't do what they were ordered to do, they were the ones that were supposed to kill the babies, and yet their calling in life was to bring the babies into life. And they were caught between the military and their calling and their conscience and God. And they refused to kill the babies. And they had to make up lies and tell those stories. I tried, I got there as fast as I could, but the baby was already born. Those babies are really healthy. You know, those women, they just give birth, those babies come. Now, we know they were lying. The soldiers probably knew they were lying, but they had to make that choice every time they stood at the point of a sword, having to make up that story. They had to hold the line. Otherwise, Moses never would have been born. Miriam wouldn't have had time to dream up this whole story of the waterproof basket and putting him down in the water. And if those invisible people hadn't done what they needed to do, there wouldn't have been any Moses. And who would have led the Exodus? Well, God could have raised up somebody else. But somewhere along the line, people had to do their job and stick together. Moses did emerge as the runner. And this is where we need to pay attention to our concepts of what the one who takes the ball and runs out in front and goes with it is going to really be like. Because even though Moses was the one who was called to take the ball and run and lead the people out of Egypt, we needn't think he was perfect. You don't need to answer out loud, but think about it for a minute. How old do you think Moses was when he was called to this job? Is anybody here 80 or over? Okay, you're all eligible. Moses was 80 when he got started on the process. You ready for a long hike in the desert? You ready to stare down the Pharaoh? You ready to give public speeches? That's what Moses was being called to do. Well, it says that the runner is not supposed to hesitate, not supposed to look back. Micah 6, verse 4, God says, I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. It was important that she came up with this idea of the waterproof boat to put Moses in. But later on, she led worship. She got up and danced in front of everybody, which you're not going to catch me doing. But she wasn't perfect. She got caught up in a little bit of gossip. She got zapped with something, might have been leprosy, nobody knows. And everybody knew that she got in trouble. And did they turn on her? Did they criticize her? Did they talk about her behind their back? Well, I don't know if they did that or not, but they stuck with her. And when they all had to wait in the desert, just because she had to wait and get well, that's what they did. They stuck by her. They didn't say, feel better, and take off without her. Now, Aaron, thank goodness he came along because Moses was really not ready to do public speaking. And so he would do the public speaking for Moses. But you might remember how the story ended, that he wasn't altogether perfect either. Once they got through the Red Sea and the desert and they got over with the whole time of the 10 Commandments. And Moses was gone for a really long time. It says 40 days and 40 nights. And that's a nice way of saying a really long time, and they didn't think he was ever coming back. And if you've heard the story before, you might remember that people kind of forgot that it was the great invisible one and only true God that brought them up out of Egypt. And they said to Aaron, make us a golden god. And he collected all their jewelry and all their valuables and created a god. And that's idolatry, and there was something in the 10 Commandments about that. So Miriam wasn't perfect, Aaron wasn't perfect, and Moses wasn't perfect. Remember, he's the hothead that killed somebody and had to go into exile for a while. And then later on, he got mad and slammed the stick against the rock when he was just supposed to tap it or raise his hands over it. And so he wasn't allowed to go into the promised land. So we mustn't expect that anybody out in front that's being called to lead the charge is going to be perfect, because they come from a long line of people who were really far from perfect. When we get over into the New Testament, and there's this list over in Hebrews that lists all these wonderful people who were leaders of the faith. If you go down the list, they were a bunch of dirty, rotten sinners. And they sinned in really big ways, and we would be just disgraced to think about the horrible things they've done. One thing you might want to also notice when you get over into Hebrews is that word that I told you was plural in the Old Testament when Habakkuk used it. All of a sudden it's singular when you get over into the New Testament. Singular, possessive. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38 says, but my righteous one will live by faith, and if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. We have identified Jesus as being that one, that all the other human beings have given it our best shot, and none of us can keep from shrinking back at one point or another. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory, and thank God we're saved by grace through faith. And even that faith is not of ourselves, it is the gift of God, so that no one can boast. Jesus faced trials, temptations, death, and did not shrink back. The first half of that verse back in Habakkuk says, "He whose soul is not upright in him shall fail." And we have to admit, our soul is not always upright. Hebrews 10:38 through 11 verse 2 says, "But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who believe and are saved. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for, and certain of what we do not see." This is what the ancients were commended for. What I understand that to mean is that sometimes some of us are called to lead the charge, and all of us are to gather together and do our part. And what it also means is that when we get discouraged, we need to lift each other up, because there will be days when I'm not sure I believe anything anymore, and it's going to be your job to say, "I'm here with you. I'm here to believe for you. I'm here to pray with you, to pray for you." And then when you hit that rough patch, then we all gather around you and we bolster up your faith, so that together as a group we continue following Jesus, who is the only one who's been able to stay out front and not falter. There was a big problem in New York City back in the 60s, early 70s, of graffiti on the subway cars. And with the graffiti came increased crime. You're wondering how I made that leap. Yes, there's a story about a leader who gets out in front and ordinary people who have to stick together. That's where this story's going. The graffiti was all over, and people tried all kinds of different things to conquer the enemy, to be able to protect themselves. And the enemy was crime, and it was getting worse and worse and worse, and it was more and more violence. And the more the graffiti got bad, the more violent the crime got. I've worked with people whose job was to work with the kids who get out and graffiti stuff nowadays, and they say, you know, just about everybody else has some bit of remorse or repentance or whatever, but the kids that get out there doing the graffiti are more hardened than anybody else they've ever worked with. Same thing was true in the 60s and 70s, and in New York City it was on a grand scale. So they tried putting fences up along the subway tracks where the trains would run, and that didn't work. And so then they made them double fences, and that didn't work. So they repaired the double fences, and they had dogs patrolling. And somebody said, but the dogs might bite somebody. And well, that's the idea. If they're in there and they're not supposed to be, and they figured out that if they gave the dogs food that they wouldn't get bitten, and graffiti was still all over the trains and the crime was getting worse. So then they called in a guy named David Gunn, who had cleaned up the systems in a couple of other cities, but none of the problems were as big as it was in New York. And David Gunn said, "That's a suicide mission. I don't want to take that job." And his mother, whose name nobody knows, said, "You have to, or they'll call you a chicken." So if his mother was implying that he might be a chicken, he figured he'd better do it. So he got in there and figured it out, and he decided that it was a maintenance issue. And so instead of making it a police issue or any of the other approaches, he decided it was a maintenance issue, and they started with one line at a time and gradually built up so that no train was allowed to leave the yard with graffiti on it, and they're supposed to keep moving pretty fast when they were not in the yard. And then when they came back into the yard, then they had to be cleaned. And so they had to be sprayed down. Well, he also found out at the same time that the trains weren't working very well. They kept breaking down. Well, if they break down, they're standing still for a while, and people can get a hold of them, and they can paint them. And so he made it a maintenance issue. So there's a whole fleet of people whose job was simply to maintain the trains. And so the better they worked, that means they didn't get stopped anywhere outside of the yard. And if they got painted inside the yard, they had to be cleaned before they left the yard. And it was the maintenance crew that reduced crime in New York City. They pulled together as a group, they worked together as a team. And that's great that now we know David Gunn's name. We need to really be thankful for his mother, who gave him the prod and got him to get out there. So when we're not feeling particularly brave, we need to remember Moses, who had Aaron and Miriam and the midwives and a whole bunch of other people helping them out. And we need to remember that it was David Gunn and this whole crew of maintenance workers. And then that will give us the vision, the prod, the support, whatever direction we need help from, it's there. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 says, "For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed." The righteousness doesn't come from within us. The righteousness comes from God. It's a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. It's not by works. It is by faith, at the beginning, at the end, and all the way through. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. One of the more famous of our leaders of the faith, Martin Luther, noticed when the church had really strayed from its path of living by faith. And he's most famous for nailing those 95 theses to the wall. Perhaps another way that he was particularly, or should be particularly famous, was for the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And now we think this is a grand old hymn. But he was a real icebreaker, because in his day, that's not how hymns were sung. That was a beer drinking tune. And he took good theology and put it to a beer tavern song and sang it in church. So part of what we're needing to do is keep our music going in the tradition of Martin Luther, singing the good old stuff, but also getting some of those new tunes in there. Martin Luther was a great leader. He didn't shrink back. He wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, though. I'm not going to leave you thinking he was. He was very anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, a lot of his work laid the foundation for what later became the Nazi Party. He was funded by some of the wealthiest people in the country. And he not only turned his back on the poor, but he put them down, criticized them, and made it seem like it was their fault. As he got older, he was known for outbursts of rage. On the good side, he made it possible for pastors to get married. Yay. I like this idea. On the downside, women were really gaining roles in leadership in the church before he came along, and they lost them. So was Martin Luther the hero of the church? Absolutely. Was he perfect? Not by any stretch of the imagination. So, the righteous will live by faith, knowing that however imperfect we are called to be together, to hold each other up, to pull each other together, and that our goal is to work together for the same purpose, strive for the same goal, whether we're part of that team that's holding the line, or we are, scared as we may be, and whether or not we're over 80, the one that's got the ball and is supposed to run out in front. Let's pray. Gracious, holy, and loving God, most of us get scared at the thought that we might be called upon to be the one that goes out front and leads. And sometimes when we're being called to work together, instead of supporting each other, we turn on each other. We ask that you will lift us up, that you will encourage us, that you will heal us where we're hurting, that you will give us focus and encouragement, help us know clearly which goal to run towards. Keep our eyes focused on you, Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, so that we might be made righteous by your grace and live together by faith in you. In your name, Jesus, we pray.